Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing Book One of Plato's Republic, specifically the second half, which revolves around the thesis of a character named Thrasymachus, right? That name is a little bit of a mouthful, but Thrasymachus is a major figure in the Republic, and he advances a view which is pretty unique in ethical theory. And he claims that justice is the advantage of the stronger, right? So, and I like to talk about this at this point in the semester because it really highlights, I think, the thinking behind what we've been labeling a profit first orientation, right? Or at least a version of it. But before we get to that, in the Republic, the first half of the Republic is kind of going back and forth on definitions of justice, right? That's what the Republic's all about. They go through a series of definitions, and most of them are kind of, your kind of classic, traditional concept of justice as some sense of fairness, right? They talk about giving back to someone what is owed to them, and this idea of kind of evening the scales and giving people what they deserve, right? And then Thrasymachus kind of bursts on the scene, and he says, you guys are all full of it. This is not what justice is. What justice really is the advantage of the stronger, right? And what he means by that is that people in power decide what is right, right? And so basically, the slogan for this is "Might is right." Right, and it's an equivalence there, that our sense of right, our sense of justice, our sense of fairness, our sense of what is, ethical in some sense, it just boils down to what people in power claim is right, and then we kind of all kind of glom onto that, right, and we kind of adopt it, and and it's the advantage of the stronger, or the interest of the stronger, meaning that people who are very rich and very powerful create laws and rules that are advantageous to themselves, right? The things that make them richer and make them more powerful. And then what happens is the masses kind of adopt those rules, and they follow them, and they think when you follow basically the rules of the people in power, then you see yourself and others as doing right? He gives a series of definitions, and but they're all kind of around the same idea, and he will say, like, it's just to follow the law, but the idea is that it's just for the masses to kind of fall in line with what people in power claim is right. If you look in my notes, I talk about moral objectivism and moral relativism, and one way to understand overall Thrasymachus's position is that it's kind of relativism, meaning he's rejecting the idea that there is some kind of objective moral standard, right? He's really just saying that different countries are led by different people who all make different rules, and that's it, right? And in that way, he thinks that there's no kind of like universal sense of right and wrong, that we can kind of evaluate each individual leader against, right? On the other hand, you could also understand Thrasymachus as advancing a kind of ethical egoism, right? The idea that people who are in power are just better at meeting their own self-interests, right? And the only way to kind of gauge whether or not someone is a better kind of ruler is whether they really do meet their own self-interest, and they stay in power longer, and they gain in wealth and all that kind of stuff. But it really is this position that all of our ethical sensibility is really just based on power, right? And that's what it really boils down to. And as we'll see, Thrasymachus is really advancing a view that you can see in business, where people think that, look, if you have a lot of money, you're entitled to, stamp out your competition, right? That life is competition, and what is right is when you basically win, right? In some way, right? If you are able to take out the market share, then you deserve it, right? If you run a big company and you make a ton of money, then you deserve that, right? And if you don't, then you deserve that as well, right? You know, that's the kind of position that we're going to be considering, right? Now, Plato disagrees with this quite a bit. Plato has a more classic kind of conception of ethics where, what's right and wrong is much more along the lines of our kind of intuition. He has a kind of ethics of altruism where he's concerned about helping people and honesty and being a good, virtuous person, right? But there are a number of arguments that Plato levels against Socrates. I mean, not against Socrates. He is Socrates, right? Plato, his main character is Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. So I'll use Socrates and Plato interchangeably. But he levels these arguments against Thrasymachus, and there's 3 of them, right? The first one is he asks, it has to do with his definition of a ruler. Now, implicitly, what Thrasymachus is claiming is that a ruler is someone who acts out of self-interest, right? And in fact, the way to understand Thrasymachus' position is that he thinks the ideal ruler is basically what we would think is a corrupt ruler, right? A governor who, makes laws to only line his pockets, right? I mean, for Thrasymachus, this is what a governor should be doing, right? And just not getting caught, right? It's really Thrasymachus' standard. But Plato offers this alternative conception, which I think is more intuitive, which is that a ruler should act out of the interest of his or her subjects, right? So if you are the ruler of a nation, your obligation and what it is to be a good ruler is to act out of the voice of the people, meet the needs of the people, right? Act in light of or out of the interest of your constituency, right? And so by Plato's lights, right, a ruler has to be essentially, right, not acting out of self-interest, but acting out of the interest of others, right? That's what an ideal kind of ruler does, right? And so he thinks that this is kind of baked into the definition, right? And that anytime, so what Thrasymachus is proposing is actually an impoverished ruler or a corrupt ruler or a ruler that's not really good at their position, right? And there's a big theme about this, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but it has to do with the idea that doing good is kind of the essential aim of human activity, right? And the way this plays out in business is the idea that, a kind of purpose first view is the idea that, if you work on performing your craft well, then the profits will come, right? And here with the ruler, the example I like to give is that, if you think about a corrupt politician or something like this, the corruption cannot be too, what would you say, transparent, right? Or it won't work, right? If you're too transparent, if you, for example, campaign on the idea that, hey, I'm going to take all your money and then I'm going to run away with it, right? People aren't going to elect you, right? If you can have, people can kind of know you have a bad reputation, but if it's too on the nose, right, it doesn't work. Too much corruption will just kind of like make a government fall apart, right? So what that's kind of shows is that corruption is always the exception to the rule. It can't be the rule itself, right? Our ideal of a ruler, if it's someone who acts out of self-interest, then that won't fly, as they won't gain power because people have to prop them up in order for them to have power. And so what Plato's kind of point is that a ruler conceptually, right, by definition, has to be someone who acts out of the interest of others, can't be someone who acts out of self-interest, right? There's another version of this that if a ruler acts out of self-interest, and so does a doctor, and so does a horse trainer and a teacher and all this kind of stuff, then there's nothing that really separates the crafts, right? They're all aiming to do the same thing, right? Um, the second, I mean, well, Thrasymachus' response is really that he thinks Socrates is being naive. Plato's being naive in this whole thing, and that really what a person is after is money and power, right? And if you think that someone's performing their craft be out of the good of society, then you're mistaken, right? And what they really want is they want to pursue their own advantage. And Socrates gives another kind of argument, which I like to call the shoemaker argument. And this is basically, the question of like, what does a shoemaker do? It's very much in line with a ruler, right? What does a shoemaker do? And there's two answers to that, right? One is that a shoemaker makes shoes, right? The second answer is a shoemaker makes money, right? And this is really the purpose first, profit first kind of dilemma here. And what Plato wants to argue is that if you are a shoemaker and you focus, you prioritize making shoes, then you will make money, right? Because you will make good shoes and they will last long and people will like them. And once they buy some, they'll buy another pair and another pair, and they'll tell their friends and people will come. And if you make good shoes, you will make good money, right? The opposite, though, doesn't work, right? So if you focus on making money, right, and you prioritize profits, then Plato argues that your craft will suffer, right? In the case of making shoes, you'll buy inferior materials. You'll make shoes fast because you want to sell more, and you won't make them high quality, and you won't take the time to make good things. And so then when people buy it, people will say, oh, these shoes are not very good. I'm not going to come back to you. And eventually you just won't make the money out of it, right? And so if you prioritize profits, your craft suffers and then your profits suffer, right? Whereas the other way around, it works, right? And Plato really argues that this is a matter of logical consistency, right? And so it's a really interesting argument for the purpose first position. It's not so much based on, sentiment or feeling or other ethical concerns. It's basically the idea that, like, if you make cars, then you should be focused on making good cars, right? If you're a restaurant, you should be focused on making good food and making people feel comfortable and welcome, right? If you run a hotel, then you should be focused on giving people good service, right? That's the idea. And then if you do those things, everything else lines up. And then the last point is one that's a little bit more convoluted, but it's basically the argument of honor among thieves, right? And what Plato points out is that, look, even if you have kind of like a band of criminals, right, they have to exhibit a certain degree of cooperation, trust, and harmony, understanding, virtues, right, in order to pull off their crimes, right? So there has to be a certain amount of communication, a certain amount of trust for the band of thieves to be able to be thieves, right? And this is the idea of honor among thieves. There's still some kind of code, some kind of sense of what's right, like, that they don't snitch on each other, and that, they each kind of take their piece of the pie or whatever after they pull off a heist or something like this. And again, this is along the same lines, right? Plato really has this one line of thought that to do anything, you really have to exhibit this kind of appreciation for what is good, these kind of correct ideals, right? And that in a certain sense, conceptually, the good is kind of must precede conceptually the bad, right? In the sense that, there has to be a focus on doing things well in order to kind of either leave the option for people to do the wrong thing, or even to be to be able to do bad, right? And that doing bad is always kind of like the exception to the rule, right? And so the reason for this reading is really to set up this debate between a profit first and a purpose first kind of view. Thrasymachus is really kind of hammering that profit first view. And he really thinks that self-interest is our standard, right, of what is good and what is right, and that everyone has an obligation to look out for their self-interest. Life is competition, this whole thing, right? And Plato's really kind of arguing the opposite, right? And he thinks, no, that doesn't make sense. If everyone is just out for self-interest, kind of our sense of cooperation kind of crumbles, right? So yeah, that's just kind of setting that up, and this will set up the debate between Mackey and Friedman in later videos. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.